The pre-dawn silence of the African bush was a tapestry woven from 1,000 subtle sounds. The distant cry of a nightjar, the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, the rhythmic drip of rain from the broad leaves of ancient trees. But on one particular morning, a new, utterly unexpected element was introduced into this natural symphony, sending a shiver of both wonder and stark alarm down Sarah's spine. A young leopard, its coat a mesmerizing pattern of rosettes deepened by the dim light, lay curled with an almost domestic contentment on the wooden planks of her doorstep. The rain, a steady, whispering curtain, fell softly around it, yet the creature remained dry, nestled snugly beneath the slight overhang of her porch roof. Its presence was a stark, bewildering incongruity. Leopards were elusive, solitary hunters, rarely venturing so close to human habitation, least of all seeking shelter with such casual audacity. Sarah, an American wildlife conservationist, had carved out a life of dedicated solitude in this remote research station. Her home was a sturdy but humble structure nestled deep within an unnamed African country, surrounded by a wilderness teeming with life and often danger. She had arrived here years ago, driven by an unyielding passion for animals, particularly the large predators whose existence hung ever precariously in the balance. Her days were a relentless cycle of tracking, data collection, and battling the formidable challenges of conservation in a world increasingly encroaching on its wild spaces. She thrived on the quiet intensity of her work, the profound connection to the natural world that few ever experienced. Her hands, though calloused from field work, moved with a gentle precision, whether calibrating a camera trap or tending to a fallen bird. Her intellect was sharp, constantly dissecting the intricate webs of ecosystem dynamics, yet her heart held a deep, almost spiritual reverence for every creature, no matter how small or fierce. The leopard, no more than a year old by her estimation, lifted its head slightly, its amber eyes meeting hers through the reinforced glass of the door. There was no aggression, no snarl, merely a calm, almost inquiring gaze. It was a look that spoke volumes, yet whispered nothing definitive, leaving Sarah utterly perplexed. This was not the behavior of a healthy, fearful wild cat encountering a human. Its posture was relaxed, its breathing even, as if this was the most natural place in the world for it to be. The rain intensified slightly, drumming a hypnotic rhythm against the tin roof, and the young leopard merely closed its eyes again, settling deeper into its temporary sanctuary. This unprecedented encounter immediately triggered a cascade of conflicting emotions within Sarah. Her scientific training screamed at the abnormality of the situation. Wild animals, especially apex predators, did not seek out human shelter. This was a significant departure from normal wildlife behavior, a red flag flapping vigorously in the stormy morning air. Was it injured, sick, displaced, orphaned? Her professional instincts urged caution, distance, and meticulous observation. Yet, a more primal, empathetic response stirred within her, a profound sense of concern for this vulnerable creature seeking refuge from the elements. The rational part of her mind knew the immense danger of habituating a wild leopard, the ethical lines blurred by such close proximity. Yet, the sight of its youthful vulnerability, the way it seemed to explicitly trust the safety of her porch in the driving rain, tugged at something deep within her. It was a living, breathing paradox, a wild enigma that had chosen her doorstep as its temporary haven. The incident was unlike anything she had ever witnessed in her years in the field, challenging every established protocol and understanding she possessed. What was she supposed to do? How was she supposed to react to a situation so profoundly outside the bounds of conventional wildlife management? The rain continued, relentless and indifferent, while the young leopard slept on, oblivious to the storm brewing within Sarah's heart and mind. For those of you who find stories like this compelling, about the extraordinary connections between humans and the wild, make sure to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what happens next. The young leopard, whom Sarah had unofficially named Storm, continued its perplexing ritual. Every rainy morning, without fail, there it was, curled on her doorstep, a silent, speckled sentinel against the gray dawn. Its presence had escalated from a one-off curiosity to an unsettling pattern, a daily enigma that deepened Sarah's concern. She observed its behavior closely, scrutinizing for any signs of injury, obvious illness, or aggressive intent, but found none. Storm appeared healthy, if a little lean around the flanks, and remarkably docile for a wild predator. This consistent, almost ritualistic return baffled her scientific mind, raising more questions than answers about the creature's circumstances. What could compel a wild leopard, an apex hunter, to seek refuge or companionship so regularly, so predictably, at a human dwelling? The primary obstacle wasn't just the leopard's unusual behavior, but the inherent danger of habituating a wild animal. Sarah knew, deep within her conservationist principles, that feeding or encouraging proximity to humans was a cardinal sin in wildlife management. This truth echoed in the occasional crackling satellite calls with her distant colleagues back at headquarters. Their voices, though often delayed by atmospheric interference, carried a clear undercurrent of concern and disapproval. They spoke of ethical implications, safety risks, and the potential for a dangerous precedent if word got out. Sarah would try to explain the leopard's inexplicable docility, its unleopard-like demeanor, but her words felt thin and unconvincing even to her own ears, swallowed by the vast distance and the abstract nature of their remote advice. Their suggestions were always the same: deter it, scare it away, re-establish the natural human-animal boundary. Sarah had, of course, attempted to resolve the situation using conventional methods. In the initial days, she would try to deter Storm gently. She'd make sudden, loud noises from inside, hoping the sharp sounds would startle it away without causing undue stress. Sometimes she'd simply keep the heavy wooden door shut, listening to the soft pitter-patter of rain on the corrugated iron roof, acutely aware of the powerful, silent presence just beyond the threshold. But Storm persisted. It would sometimes shift its position, perhaps rising to stretch, but it rarely left. Its golden eyes, when Sarah risked a quick peek through a small window, held no fear, only a calm, almost expectant gaze that unnerved her. She tried leaving the lights on, hoping the artificial glow would be off-putting. She even attempted to use her strong-smelling insect repellent near the doorway, a desperate measure to exploit a leopard's sensitive nose. Nothing worked. The leopard seemed immune to her subtle deterrence, unwavering in its morning vigil. Observing it from a distance through her binoculars, Sarah searched diligently for physical infirmities. Was it too old to hunt effectively? Was a hidden injury preventing it from navigating its natural territory? She scanned its lithe form for limps, for matted fur, for any visible wound, but found only the sleek, powerful musculature of a healthy, if persistently present, wild animal. The mystery deepened with each rainy morning, pulling Sarah further into its strange, compelling orbit, leaving her increasingly bewildered and yet undeniably intrigued by the enigmatic creature she had reluctantly named Storm. The situation was escalating, demanding a decision she wasn't yet ready to make. Sarah felt an increasingly palpable pull towards the young leopard, a connection that defied all her training and professional detachment. It had moved beyond simple curiosity or scientific observation. Now it was tinged with a deep, unsettling empathy. She started noticing subtle shifts in Storm's behavior, the way its ears would twitch at distant sounds, a slight limp she hadn't initially registered, or the intermittent, shallow cough that sometimes rattled its lean frame. These were not the actions of a perfectly healthy animal merely seeking a dry spot. This creature, she realized, was vulnerable, perhaps even distressed, in ways she hadn't yet fully grasped. She found herself leaving a small metal dish of water just outside her door one drizzly morning, placing it discreetly so it wouldn't seem like a direct invitation. To her surprise, after a cautious sniff, Storm tentatively lapped at the cool liquid. Encouraged, she later tried a small portion of cooked meat, carefully stripped from a piece of chicken she'd prepared for herself. The leopard hesitated longer this time, its golden eyes fixed on her through the screen door, before finally approaching and devouring the offering with an almost desperate hunger. This hesitant acceptance felt like a significant step, a fragile bridge forming between their two vastly different worlds. This burgeoning unspoken bond, however, existed against a backdrop of increasing external pressures. Her weekly satellite phone calls to the research headquarters grew increasingly tense. Her colleagues, thousands of miles away and reliant on her clinical reports, expressed rising concern, their voices tinged with a professional alarm she found increasingly frustrating. "Sarah, you understand the protocols," Dr. Henderson had stated, his voice devoid of his usual warmth. "Habituation of a predator, especially a leopard, is not only dangerous for you, but it fundamentally compromises its wild nature. It creates an animal that has lost its fear of humans, making it a target, or worse, a threat to local communities." They urged her, with growing insistence, to take stricter measures. Loud noises, deterrent sprays, even the mention of tranquilization and relocation hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the gentle, almost heartbreaking dependency she perceived in Storm's subtle glances. The idea of forcibly removing the creature, especially if it was unwell, felt like a betrayal. Driven by a growing need to understand Storm's peculiar attachment to her doorstep, Sarah dedicated more and more of her time to observing the leopard's movements beyond their morning rendezvous. She meticulously tracked its faint prints in the softened earth after the rains, noting its preferred routes through the dense undergrowth. She set up discreet, motion-activated cameras further afield, hoping to catch glimpses of its daily life away from her station. What she began to uncover was deeply troubling. The pristine wilderness she had once believed herself to be studying in isolation was not as untouched as it seemed. She found discarded plastic bottles and rusted food tins, far from any established human settlement. More chillingly, she discovered crudely cut snares, disguised among the vegetation, lethal traps clearly designed for medium to large game. There were signs of hastily built, temporary campsites, remnants of small fires and cigarette butts, suggesting human presence where there should have been none. The realization hit her with sickening clarity. Storm's territory, the very expanse of land it needed to survive, was being encroached upon. The leopard wasn't just seeking shelter from the rain, it was seeking refuge from a far greater, more insidious threat. Each clue she uncovered cemented a dawning suspicion. Storm wasn't just a curious young leopard, but potentially a displaced and deeply endangered one. The evidence Sarah gathered painted a grim picture, solidifying her fears into a chilling reality. A significant and escalating threat to the local wildlife, particularly the majestic leopards, was unfolding around her. The snares were not isolated incidents. She discovered several more, strategically placed along game trails, their crude construction designed for maximum harm to any creature unlucky enough to step into their hidden grasp. These weren't traps set by subsistence hunters. The scale and type suggested something far more organized, far more sinister. Following the faint trails left by the makeshift campsites, she stumbled upon clearings littered with the remains of illegally culled animals, some bearing the distinct marks of leopard pelts having been crudely removed. The air hung heavy with the stench of decay and betrayal, a stark contrast to the vibrant life she had come to study and protect. Storm's territory was not merely compromised, it was actively being plundered, its very existence threatened by unchecked human greed. This unveiled threat thrust Sarah into a profound ethical dilemma, a chasm opening between her scientific training and her burgeoning compassion. The protocols of her research organization were crystal clear: no habituation of wild animals, strict non-interference, and a commitment to maintaining the ecological balance without human intervention. To report the poaching activity would be one thing, but to protect Storm, a wild animal that had now, in an unprecedented way, sought refuge with her, felt like a direct contravention of everything she was supposed to uphold. Her scientific mind, rigorously trained in objectivity and data analysis, screamed at her to maintain distance, to drive Storm away, to let nature, however brutal, take its course. Yet, her empathetic nature, the very core of her passion for wildlife, rebelled. To send Storm back into an increasingly dangerous environment, knowing the immediate threats, felt like a conscious act of condemnation. This wasn't merely a matter of a lost cub. This was a young leopard, confused and vulnerable, seeking an inexplicable connection with her in the face of imminent peril. Her career, painstakingly built over years of dedication, hung precariously in the balance. More acutely, the safety of both herself and the animal was at stake. The clash between her intellectual understanding of conservation ethics and the raw, urgent instinct to protect felt almost unbearable. Every morning, as the rain began to fall, bringing Storm to her doorstep, this internal struggle intensified. Storm's continued, almost ritualistic presence on her doorstep transformed in meaning. It ceased to be a random act of a curious wild animal seeking simple shelter from a downpour. Instead, it resonated with the desperate plea of a creature on the brink, a silent cry for help or refuge from a dangerously unstable situation. The leopard watched her with an intensity that transcended mere animal curiosity. There was a depth in those golden eyes, a vulnerability that seemed to pierce through her professional facade. It almost felt as if Storm was deliberately choosing her, recognizing a glimmer of safety, a fleeting moment of respite from the relentless threats lurking just beyond the threshold of her isolated station. The way it would settle, not aggressively, but with a quiet, almost resigned patience, spoke volumes. It exhibited a level of trust that defied all her learned understanding of wild predator behavior. This perceived trust, whether born of desperation or genuine instinct, weighed heavily on Sarah. Each rainy morning, as the young leopard appeared, a silent sentinel against the storm, Sarah's vigilance grew. She watched its movements, its expressions, its subtle shifts in posture, trying to decipher the unspoken narrative of its struggle. She checked her perimeter more frequently, her senses heightened, searching for any sign of the poachers whose cruel activities had now become an undeniable reality. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she could no longer remain a passive observer. The lines between scientific detachment and personal intervention were blurring irrevocably. The rain, once merely a meteorological phenomenon, had become a harbinger of a decision she knew she would soon have to make. The dawning suspicion that Storm was not merely curious but deeply endangered crystallized into stark reality during one particularly violent storm night. The rain lashed against the corrugated iron roof of her research station, a relentless deluge that seemed to amplify every crack of thunder and flash of lightning. Sarah, restless and unable to sleep, was listening to the tempest when a different sound cut through the roar of the wind and rain, a guttural, distressed cry, unmistakably feline, emanating from just outside her door. It wasn't the usual soft rumble of Storm's presence or the gentle huff she had grown accustomed to. This was raw, pain-filled, and desperate. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to remain inside, to adhere to the rigid protocols that separated human from wild danger. Yet, the anguish in Storm's cry was too potent to ignore. It echoed the silent plea she had sensed in its golden eyes for weeks. Overriding every shred of scientific caution she possessed, Sarah moved to the door, her hand trembling as she unlatched it. The wind tore at the opening, momentarily battling her strength, but she pushed it open just enough to peer into the chaos of the night. What she saw confirmed her darkest fears. Huddled close to the wall, partly obscured by the driving rain, was Storm. Its usually sleek fur was matted and clinging, and one of its hind legs was twisted at an unnatural angle, held aloft. Even in the dim light filtering from her station, Sarah could discern an ugly, deep laceration around its ankle, an angry red wound where the fur was torn away. And then she saw it clearly. A thin, glinting wire, still partially embedded in the flesh, the unmistakable mark of a poacher's snare. The sight was a punch to the gut, a visceral confirmation of the insidious threat she had been investigating. Storm hadn't just been displaced. It had been actively targeted, injured, and left to suffer. The cries were not just from the pain of its wound, but from the terror of its predicament, trapped and exposed in the unforgiving storm. In that moment, the ethical dilemmas, the protocols, the warnings from headquarters, all evaporated into the storm-swept night. There was only one imperative: to help this injured, suffering creature. Without a second thought, Sarah made the impulsive, unprecedented decision. "Come in," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind, pushing the door wider. "Come in, Storm." The young leopard, its eyes wide with pain and a flicker of something akin to desperate hope, hesitated. It shifted its weight, a low growl rumbling in its chest, a primal reaction to the sudden, open invitation into a human space. But the pain, the cold, and the overwhelming sense of vulnerability clearly outweighed its ingrained caution. Slowly, painstakingly, Storm limped forward, dragging its injured leg. Each movement was agony, yet it moved with a surprising, fragile dignity. It passed the threshold, stepping onto the clean, dry floor of her research station, its body tense, ready to bolt, yet compelled by a deeper need. Sarah held her breath, watching its every tense muscle. There was no aggression, only a profound exhaustion and a raw, suffering trust. The moment Storm was inside, Sarah carefully but quickly closed the door, sealing them both within the relative sanctuary of her station. The air crackled with a strange mix of fear, relief, and an almost sacred quiet, broken only by the continued drumming of rain outside. She knew this act was a catastrophic rupture of every rule, every guideline she had ever been taught as a wildlife conservationist. This was not merely habituation. This was intervention on a scale she had never imagined. As Storm collapsed weakly onto the floor, its labored breathing filling the small space, Sarah moved to her satellite phone. Her hands, though still trembling, moved with a newfound resolve. She typed out a concise, urgent message to her superiors, detailing the night's events, the snare, the injury, and her decision to bring the leopard inside. She knew this could jeopardize her position, her career, everything she had worked for. But looking at the injured, vulnerable creature now lying barely a few feet away, she also knew she couldn't have done anything else. The justification for her actions, she understood, would never be found in a protocol manual, but rather in the deep, unwavering conviction that some lines, once crossed, were simply about compassion and the urgent duty to protect a life. The sudden guttural cries that had pierced the stormy night had driven a cold spike of fear directly into Sarah's heart. Now, with Storm inside, a palpable tension filled the small living space of the research station. The leopard, its magnificent coat matted with rain and blood, lay huddled in a corner, its usually piercing golden eyes dulled with pain and exhaustion. The snare had not completely severed the limb, but it had dug deep, leaving a jagged, infected wound just above its paw. Sarah, her hands trembling slightly, moved with purposeful urgency. She retrieved her limited veterinary kit: antiseptic solution, gauze, a pair of sterile forceps, and a strong, broad-spectrum antibiotic she usually reserved for research animals needing immediate care. Days bled into a tense, surreal week. Sarah moved cautiously around Storm, her every action measured, her voice a low, constant murmur of reassurance. The leopard, incredibly, tolerated her ministrations. It allowed her to clean the wound, apply antiseptic, and even administer oral antibiotics mixed into its food, generous portions of cooked chicken and scavenged wild game she'd had frozen. Each morning she would find Storm slightly stronger, the swelling in its leg slowly receding, its eyes regaining a flicker of their wild intensity. The initial fear began to recede, replaced by a profound sense of responsibility and a strange, burgeoning companionship. She found herself talking to Storm, explaining her actions, sharing her concerns, as if the animal could understand the complex tapestry of her thoughts. This unprecedented proximity, however, brought with it an internal conflict that gnawed at Sarah's conscience. The bond was deepening, undeniably so. Storm would track her movements with its eyes, sometimes even accepting a gentle, tentative stroke along its head when she offered food, a gesture that sent shivers down her spine, both of awe and of profound ethical unease. She was a conservationist, dedicated to preserving wildness, yet here she was, directly habituating a top predator. The more Storm recovered, the more acutely she felt the weight of her actions. This magnificent creature, born of the wild and belonging to it, could not, must not, stay. The ethical responsibility of rehabilitation meant returning it to its natural state, not forging an unnatural dependence. Could she truly undo the trust she was inadvertently building? Was she saving its life only to condemn it to a future vulnerability? The questions swirled, relentless and heavy. With Storm's physical condition showing marked improvement, Sarah began to shift her focus from immediate care to the daunting task of its eventual release. She knew she couldn't simply open the door and let it wander back into the snare-ridden territory. That would be a death sentence, or at best, a return to the very circumstances that had driven it to her doorstep. She needed a plan, a meticulously crafted strategy that would give Storm the best possible chance of survival. This meant finding a new, safer home, a territory far removed from the immediate threat of poachers and human encroachment, an area with ample prey and minimal human presence. Her thoughts turned to an old, retired local ranger named Elias. He was a legend among the conservation community, a man who had spent his entire life tracking, protecting, and understanding the rhythms of the African bush. Elias lived a solitary life several days' journey away, but his knowledge of the vast, unexplored regions was unparalleled. He would know the safest, most pristine habitats, the forgotten corners of the wilderness where a leopard could truly be wild again. Sarah began drafting a detailed message, outlining Storm's situation, her actions, and her desperate need for his expertise. This next step felt like a gamble, a reach into the unknown. But it was the only path forward for Storm, and for her own troubled conscience. The road to recovery was nearing its end, and the journey to true freedom was about to begin. The quiet hum of the research station, usually a comforting backdrop to Sarah's solitary work, was shattered one afternoon by the jarring approach of multiple vehicles. Dust billowed on the horizon, swirling ominously towards her sanctuary. Her heart sank. It was headquarters. She hadn't expected them so soon or in such numbers. 3 sturdy land cruisers, emblazoned with the familiar logo of the Wildlife Foundation, rumbled to a halt outside her door. Out stepped Dr. Albright, her regional director, his face a mask of stern disapproval, flanked by 2 other senior researchers and a team of uniformed security personnel. The air crackled with a tension that was almost palpable. This was no friendly check-in. This was an intervention. Sarah stepped out, her expression weary but resolute, as Albright's gaze swept past her to the closed door of the station. "Sarah, what exactly is going on here?" he demanded, his voice low but sharp with accusation. "Your reports have been concerning. We received your last message. A leopard, inside the premises. Is that correct?" She met his gaze unflinchingly. "Yes, Dr. Albright. His name is Storm. He was injured, caught in a snare. I brought him in for medical aid. He's almost fully recovered." A scoff escaped one of the other researchers. "Medical aid? Sarah, you're a conservationist, not a veterinarian, and certainly not a big cat handler. You've compromised departmental protocols, jeopardized your own safety, and potentially habituated a dangerous predator." "His territory was compromised," Sarah countered, her voice rising with a defensive passion. "Poachers, snares. I found evidence all over. I couldn't just leave him to die." She explained her planned contact with Elias, her meticulously thought-out strategy for a remote release. But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears, bouncing off a wall of established regulations and professional skepticism. Albright signaled to his team, and 2 security members moved towards the station door, their intent clear. They were here to retrieve the leopard, by force if necessary, and Sarah knew exactly what that meant for Storm. Tranquilization, an uncertain relocation, and the crushing weight of having her unique bond dismissed as reckless endangerment. Just as the security team reached the door, a low growl rumbled from within the station. It wasn't an aggressive roar, but a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the very earth. Storm, having sensed the shift in atmosphere, the intrusion of unfamiliar human presences, emerged cautiously from the shadows of the living area. His eyes, now clear and bright, fixed on the approaching figures. He moved with a newfound confidence, the limp barely perceptible, his powerful body radiating primal strength. He didn't charge, didn't snarl, but positioned himself deliberately between Sarah and the approaching team. It was a subtle, yet profound act of protection. He stood there, a magnificent wild sentinel, his gaze unwavering, his presence silencing the agitated human conversation. The security personnel froze, their movements halted by the sheer, unexpected authority of the leopard's stance. They had expected a wild animal, perhaps cowering or aggressively defensive, but not this calm, watchful loyalty. Dr. Albright, usually unflappable, took an involuntary step back. His eyes, which had been fixed on Sarah with disciplinary intent, now widened with a mixture of disbelief and, surprisingly, a flicker of understanding as they swept over Storm. "He's protecting her," whispered one of the younger researchers, his voice hushed with awe. Albright stared, a long, thoughtful silence stretching between them all. The conventional wisdom, the rigid adherence to protocol, was momentarily shattered by the raw, undeniable evidence before him. This wasn't a habituated pet. This was a wild animal, choosing its allegiance. He saw the healing leg, the robust health, the intelligent eyes that tracked their every move. And he saw Sarah standing beside the leopard, unburdened by fear, embodying a connection he had only ever read about in folklore, never witnessed in the field. Finally, Albright cleared his throat, the sound unusually soft. "Sarah," he said, his voice stripped of its earlier harshness, "explain your plan again, in detail, and tell me more about this poaching evidence you found." The turning point had arrived. The unique bond, the undeniable evidence of a deeper threat, had swayed him. It wasn't a full surrender, but it was a crucial reprieve, a tacit acknowledgement that sometimes the extraordinary calls for an extraordinary response. A new path was now open, not just for Storm, but for Sarah's unconventional approach to conservation, one that might just begin to bridge the chasm between human intervention and true wildness. The relocation of Storm began with meticulous planning, a testament to Sarah's dedication and Elias's unparalleled knowledge of the land. The senior official, swayed not just by Storm's unexpected display, but by Sarah's compelling evidence of escalating poaching, had deployed a specialized team. Their mission, to secure a new, protected territory for Storm, far from the human conflicts that had almost claimed its life, and to facilitate its safe transport. Sarah was an integral part of this team, her presence providing a calming influence on the leopard during the complex process of tranquilization and transfer. It was a heart-wrenching moment to see Storm sedated, its powerful form gently loaded into a specialized transport crate. But Sarah knew this was the vital final step towards true freedom. The journey to the new territory was long, arduous, and fraught with logistical challenges, traversing rugged terrain and dense bush. They chose a remote, pristine conservancy, managed by a community deeply committed to wildlife protection, a stark contrast to Storm's previous, compromised habitat. Upon arrival, as Storm slowly awoke from the tranquilizer, Sarah lingered, watching it with a mixture of hope and sorrow. The crate doors swung open, and after a moment of wary hesitation, Storm emerged, blinking in the unfamiliar light of its new home. It stretched, muscles rippling under sleek fur, then took a long, assessing look at the verdant landscape before it. With a silent, powerful stride, it melted into the dense foliage, disappearing as quickly as it had first appeared on her doorstep, a phantom rejoining its natural realm. Sarah watched until the last rustle of leaves faded, a profound sense of closure washing over her. Back at her research station, now devoid of Storm's quiet presence, Sarah found herself grappling with an unexpected emptiness. The daily routine felt altered. The morning rains no longer held the same anxious anticipation. The experience had been transformative, shattering her preconceived notions about the boundaries between human and wild, scientist and subject. she reflected on the myriad lessons Storm had imparted. Trust, not just the animal's trust in her, but her own trust in her instincts, and in the belief that conservation often demanded unconventional approaches when protocol failed. She had learned about the remarkable resilience of nature, embodied in Storm's journey from injured refuge seeker to a rewilded predator. More profoundly, she recognized humanity's intricate, often destructive, but also redemptive role in conservation. It wasn't just about protecting species. It was about protecting the delicate balance of ecosystems, ensuring that creatures like Storm had a future. The profound impact Storm had on her life was undeniable. It had challenged her scientific objectivity, deepened her empathy, and broadened her understanding of the complex, often heartbreaking, realities of wildlife preservation. Storm had ceased to be merely a research subject. It had become a teacher, a catalyst for personal growth, and a poignant reminder of the enduring wilderness that humanity so desperately needed to safeguard. The leopard had walked into her life during a storm, found refuge, and then, with Sarah's help, found its way back to its rightful place in the wild. While their paths had diverged, the connection remained, an invisible thread woven into the fabric of her being. Sarah's message now resonates with a new urgency. This extraordinary encounter underscores the vital importance of supporting conservation efforts globally. Every donation, every shared story, every conscious choice to protect natural habitats contributes to the survival of magnificent creatures like Storm. It is a testament to what is possible when compassion meets a commitment to preserving the wild heart of our planet. This journey with Storm was not just about saving one leopard. It was about rediscovering our own humanity within the vast, untamed beauty of the natural world.